Motion is carried. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. It is now 12:47. We will end at 1:47. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday evidence filed at the Utility and Review Board that sharply criticized Nova Scotia Power regarding the Maritime Link project. Experts hired by the Consumer Advocate and the Small Business Advocate stated that the Maritime Link is not the long-term cheapest option for Nova Scotia ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier, in light of the evidence filed by these experts, will the Premier now extend the deadline for the hearing so Nova Scotians can be certain that they are not being squeezed yet again by the NDP government and Nova Scotia Power?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The evidence that is currently before the board includes many reports. I think there are something like 15, the majority of which, in fact, the vast majority of which actually support the project. They support the fact that it is the best option for Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, the Utility and Review Board will have the opportunity to review all the evidence. That process is taking place now. They'll make inquiries of those experts. We're perfectly comfortable with that because, Mr. Speaker, we are acting in the best interest of all Nova Scotians, not just with respect to power rates, but with respect to our ability to drive our economy forward in the years to come. That, Mr. Speaker, is what this project is about. It is about ensuring that we have the best answer on power rates and we have the best answer on economic development.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear that Nova Scotia Power is driving the energy policies of this NDP government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, every independent analysis at the Utility Review Board indicates that this is not the cheapest option for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. The only two interveners who believe it is Nova Scotia Power and the NDP government led by that Premier, Mr. Speaker. Every other independent analysis that says there's more cost-effective way to sustain the energy policy of this province, Mr. Speaker. But guess what, Mr. Speaker? That would be in the best interest of Nova Scotia ratepayers and not in the best interest of Nova Scotia Power, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the evidence speaks for itself, and I want to quote, "We concluded that Nova Scotia Power's analysis was faulty, lacking in robustness, incompletely documented, and biased in favour of the applicant's desired outcome." End of quote, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, is the Premier standing with Nova Scotia Power in a project that will raise rates for the next 35 years, or will he finally stand with Nova Scotia residents?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm standing with Nova Scotia citizens. I'm standing up on behalf of them and their interests. The Leader of the Opposition, who quotes one study out of some 14 that are before the Utility and Review Board, who ignores the fact that the actual application shows very small increases and then declines in the power rates, Mr. Speaker, declines in the rates. Yes, we are working on behalf of Nova Scotia citizens. Now, I wonder if last night he was busy on the phone to Quebec Hydro. Does he phone them? Does he email them? Or does he just ask them to turn on Ledge TV and watch him at work?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, that answer is as weak as the TV ad, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier has brought out to attack you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, if he can find any more money, I would encourage him to run that ad, because every time he runs it, Nova Scotians come to the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, to stand up against that government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is very clear, Mr. Speaker, it is very clear that this government, led by this Premier, has been standing up, Mr. Speaker, and protecting the monopoly of Nova Scotia Power instead of standing up and protecting the ratepayers of this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it has been very clear. All of the other independent analysis of this project has said it's too expensive. There are other homegrown options, Mr. Speaker, here in the province of Nova Scotia that this government should be looking at instead of promoting a project that will create economic development in Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, why is the Premier promoting a project that will create jobs and investment in Newfoundland and Labrador instead of standing up and creating jobs for here in the province of Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, I remember when he was getting on a plane, running over to see Danny Williams, begging to be part of this project, Mr. Speaker. I remember when the battle cry from the Liberal Party was, we need a Made in Atlantic Canada solution. Well, they've given up on that, Mr. Speaker, and now their battle cry is Vive la Quebec Hydro.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we see that the UARB's own consultant has filed evidence on the Maritime Link project, which says, and I quote, that the project has not been demonstrated to be a definitive least-cost incremental supply resource for Nova Scotia power system, and I will table that. In other words, Mr. Speaker, it is not the lowest cost option for Nova Scotians, as says yet another independent consultant, this one, the one hired by the Utility and Review Board himself. That's in addition to the Consumer and Small Business Advocates consultant who reported yesterday, and I quote, "We fully refute the applicant's assertion that the Maritime Link project represents the lowest cost alternative," and I will table that. But despite the growing number of consultants saying it's not the least cost option, the Premier on his own continues to tell Nova Scotians that it is. So I will ask the Premier, Mr. Speaker, why does he insist on telling Nova Scotians that Muskrat Falls, the Maritime Link, are the lowest cost when so many experts are now telling them it isn't so?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the length of experts that are appearing before the board that say that this is the lowest cost option is lengthy. Many of them were hired by the board itself. One of the salient features that people should understand about the Utility and Review Board process, I'm sure you do, Mr. Speaker, is that the way that we arrive at the best. What's that? I'm sure you understand that the best way for this to get to the best answer is to have a number of opinions, to have opinions on both sides, for them to look at them fairly, to review the evidence, and of course to come to the best decision on behalf of the people of Nova Scotia. We are committed to that process. We are committed to this process. It is the members opposite who would simply dismiss it and say they should not do this job.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the best way would be to have a Premier that doesn't make up his mind before he knows how much it costs and then force the URB into an artificial deadline to go through. That would be the best way. We have the Consumer Advocate and the Small Business Advocate with their experts saying it's not the lowest cost. Now the board's own consultant says it's not the lowest cost, Mr. Speaker. How can the Premier justify telling Nova Scotia families who are already struggling with the highest power rates in all of Canada to pay more because he says it's the lowest cost when so many others say it isn't?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, quite the opposite, Mr. Speaker. There's a host of expert opinion that says this is the lowest cost alternative. Mr. Speaker, what we are doing is dealing with a situation put in place by the Conservative government. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker. Every cost increase that has taken place in the last 4 years, in fact, in the last 10 years, has been as a result of the policy initiatives of the Liberal Party and of the Conservative Party. It was the Liberal Party that created Amera. It was the Liberal Party that put in place the policy vacuum that was changed for the very first time by this government in order to ensure that there was fairness for the ratepayers.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Speaker, those must be the same experts that told him that it was okay to raise the HST. Because when someone tells the Premier you can raise taxes or you can raise power rates, that's who he listens to, not to the Consumer Advocate, not to the taxpayers or the ratepayers of Nova Scotia. And that's why it is his government's policies that have raised our power rates by 30% in the last 4 years, and nobody else's but his, Mr. Speaker. Now that we have real independent experts saying that Muskrat Falls is not the lowest cost, will the Premier agree to stop this madness, press the reset button, and allow the UARB to do a full and complete and independent, on its own timeline review of this project compared to every other alternative?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly what's happening. They are doing a complete, thorough review. They are doing it of all of the other alternatives, Mr. Speaker. That is what they're doing. And this is in stark contrast to what happened under the Conservative government, where they simply accepted that fossil fuels were the way to supply energy to this province, led to increasing power rates. And, Mr. Speaker, at a time in the history of the province when the Conservative government was receiving the largest ever royalty payments, some $450 million in offshore royalty payments, what did they do on energy policy? They went back in and put 10% onto the power rates of Nova Scotia in order to wring money out of the lowest income Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is also for the Premier. You know, we just heard the Premier say that there should be lots of studies and research. And he's right. He's right about that. The problem is the only study other than Nova Scotia Power's, which endorses the project filed before the board, was the Dalton study, which was commissioned by the NDP. All of the other ones filed do not endorse the Premier's position. In fact, Liberty, the board auditors, Liberty says that Nova Scotia Power overestimated gas prices. Synapse, the board's consultant, says that Indigenous wind here in Nova Scotia would be significantly cheaper. The consultants for the Consumer Advocate say that all of the other options would be cheaper. In fact, the only thing that all those consultants agree on is that the Maritime Link is the most expensive option. So, Mr. Speaker, in the document tabled yesterday, we quoted it saying the Maritime Link transaction shortchanges Nova Scotia ratepayers. At the conclusion of the 35-year project term, Nova Scotia has paid its 20% cost, but is left with none of the benefits. Now, since the beginning, we've raised concerns that Nova Scotians are being asked by the NDP to pay the full cost and own nothing. This was the same problem they almost got us in with the convention centre until we lobbied so that we would own it at the end. So, Mr. Speaker, if the project is approved by the Utility and Review Board, will the Premier demand that Nova Scotians own the Maritime Link after the bills are paid?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if there was ever a master of distortion, it has to be the member for Dartmouth East. What he has said is just not true. There are many reports before the Utility and Review Board that endorse the project, that demonstrate that it is the lowest rates for Nova Scotians, and I think it's a shame. I mean, they go so far out of their way to try and prevent a project from going forward, one that will not only deliver the lowest and fairest rates for Nova Scotians, but one that will also create an environment for economic development in the region. One would be the contributor to the growth of our regional economy, one that will create thousands of jobs, not only in Newfoundland and Labrador, but in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, one that is demonstrably brings one of the lowest rates possible for new power, Mr. Speaker. That is what the facts are, and I know that they are uncomfortable and inconvenient for the member for Dartmouth East.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what's inconvenient is that nothing the Premier just said is backed up by anything filed at the board yesterday. In fact, completely the opposite. And Mr. Speaker, both opposition parties have tabled those documents. If the Premier thinks that things were filed yesterday that support what he's saying, he should table it, which he hasn't done. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, this should not surprise the Premier. In fact, before he got on board, the Federal-Provincial Joint Review Panel in Newfoundland said, quote, the panel concluded that Nalcor's analysis showing Muskrat Falls to be the best and least cost to meet domestic energy requirements was inadequate. And it went on to say the panel concluded that if the recommended economic and alternative studies show there are alternative ways of meeting electricity demand, that there are more economically viable and environmentally socially responsible ways than Muskrat Falls. And I'll table that document. Mr. Speaker, that sounds awfully familiar to much of the evidence filed yesterday in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, why is the Premier only relying on the one report commissioned by the NDP government and dismissing all of the evidence that doesn't support his position?
Honourable the Premier.
Quite the opposite, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that there is a plethora of reports before the Utility and Review Board, the vast majority of which support the project. And I understand that for the Liberal Party and for the official opposition, it is much easier to stand around and, be the masters of cynicism and to want to. It is always easier to tear down than to build up. But you know something, Mr. Speaker, the people on this side, we're about building the future for Nova Scotia. We're about building the economic future of our region. That is what we are committed to, and we will not be deterred.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, even if the Premier was right that there were 4 independent studies backing it up, that is still far less than the ones that were filed that showed that it didn't meet that. So even if he was right, it still wouldn't be the majority. Mr. Speaker, evidence filed by the Canadian Wind Energy Association yesterday, and I'm sure the Premier will call them a special interest group, also raises concerns. But then the fact is, the findings of their consultant was the same as the findings of the consumer advocates, experts, and the small business advocates. So, Mr. Speaker, surely the Premier isn't suggesting that all of those international experts are wrong. The Premier is instead choosing jobs in Nova Scotia, renewable energy investments in Nova Scotia, and instead choosing Labrador. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't make any sense. Mr. Speaker, why is the Premier so hostile and critical of local, made in Nova Scotia renewable energy projects?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the evidence to the contrary is spectacular, and the reality is that we have been the largest supporters of renewable energy in the history of the province. But, Mr. Speaker, I want the member for Dartmouth East to know that people across the province do not mistake cynicism for wisdom.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on a new question.
Mr. Speaker, in Newfoundland, the Utility and Review Board there decided that they didn't have enough time to review the information because of an artificial timeline set by the Newfoundland government. The same thing is playing out here. And now there's significant new information which calls into question the assumptions used by Emera, Nova Scotia Power, and their best buddy, the Premier. Yesterday, at the Renewable Energy Conference, a conference which this government refused to attend, there was talk about storage options for backup to wind power as an investment in this province. And yet the Premier continues to choose Newfoundland jobs over Nova Scotia jobs. And the Dalton study still refuses to consider any backup option but natural gas. Mr. Speaker, it's clear the Premier believes in this project and has staked his personal credibility on it. So if he's not afraid of a full review at the board, if he truly believes that a full review would result in the project being found to be the best option, why will he not allow the board to have whatever time it needs to review the project and reverse his minister's April 12th decision not to grant an extension?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I suppose that reviews could go on forever and nothing would get done. That's essentially what the Liberal Party position is on everything, on economic development, on health care, on everything, which is they will proudly do nothing. They go from one part of the province to the other saying, we will do nothing, we will do nothing, we will do nothing. Well, I got news for you, Mr. Speaker. That is not the answer to the issues and the problems that are faced by the people of Nova Scotia. We are getting things done for Nova Scotians, and that includes making sure they have safe, stable, secure access to energy.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East. on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it funny that the evidence filed yesterday says that it is neither secure, neither stable, nor even the lowest rates? So, Mr. Speaker, it's pretty clear the NDP are rapidly turning against renewable energy developers in Nova Scotia. How else can the government explain why they would choose to knowingly burden Nova Scotians with a project that increases rates over 35 years when evidence yesterday points to the fact that renewable energy projects built in Nova Scotia would not only result in economic opportunities and jobs in this province, but would also be cheaper than the Maritime Link? Mr. Speaker, in the document that I just tabled, it says, quote, "We conclude that Indigenous wind are less expensive than the Maritime Link under all cases we tested. Moreover, Indigenous wind has the important added benefits of flexibility, diversity, and scalable capital outlay. A large long-term ironclad financial commitment to the Maritime Link project will preclude the province's ability to react and change to future changes in load, technical progress, and changing environmental goals." So why does the Premier refuse to examine and use local homegrown renewable energy projects instead of Muskrat Falls, now that the evidence is that the lowest, fairest long-term cost is wind and not the Maritime Link?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I love about the member for Dartmouth East is he can say ridiculous things with a straight face. I mean, anybody who travels around, whenever he travels around Nova Scotia, he must see the wind turbines that are going up across the province. I mean, maybe he hasn't been to Amherst for a while and had a chance to go across the Tantramar Marsh and look at the number of wind turbines that are there because of the renewable energy strategy of this government. I know he wasn't in Copenhagen when Nova Scotia was winning awards for its renewable energy policy, Mr. Speaker. Does it surprise me that the Wind Energy Association would put in a brief that supports wind energy? No, Mr. Speaker, not at all. I understand their position. I'm sure the Utility and Review Board will consider it among all the other professional opinions that it receives, Mr. Speaker, and I have confidence the Utility and Review Board will make the right decision.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I might add I also wasn't on Mr. Huskisson's jet to Newfoundland, but the fact is, here's the Premier of our province who must be taking lessons from Mark LaVenture, the EA, to the Minister of Environment, who has decided that they'll criticize anybody who submits information to the board that doesn't agree with the NDP position, and I'll table his tweet from last night. Mr. Speaker, yesterday at the Renewable Energy Conference, again a conference I point out the Minister of Energy refused to attend, I was fortunate to hear from many independent renewable energy producers who want sustainable long-term power in Nova Scotians and who have options here and are now supported by the evidence submitted yesterday. Given that the evidence filed yesterday proves Nova Scotia wind, as just one example, would be cheaper than the Maritime Link, it's clear to this House that the NDP are simply anti-Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier explain to this House why the NDP government wants to increase power rates for a generation instead of choosing local independent energy producers here in Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the only one of the analyses that are actually before the board that looks at the 35-year cost of this project and the benefits to Nova Scotia is the Dalton report. It looks at all, and it compares all of the other alternatives, Mr. Speaker. It concludes absolutely unequivocally that it is the best and lowest cost project for ratepayers in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, that's the first thing. The second thing, with respect to the Wind Energy Conference that he's talking about, in fact, Nova Scotia's officials are there, Mr. Speaker. The reality is they contacted us only on Monday, and as he knows, the House is in session and House business is taking up the time of the Minister and the Ministers. In fact, the Minister is in estimates, and you're asking questions of him.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today the government is talking about referendums as protection for Nova Scotia taxpayers when governments make changes to the HST. But oddly, they've limited themselves only to changes to HST rebates, which, as far as I know, all parties in this House already support the rebates that are provided to Nova Scotians that need tax relief, Mr. Speaker. But what's so interesting is what's missing, which is any commitment to have referendums if a government gets elected to office on a promise not to raise the HST and then actually goes ahead and raises it after the election. And if there's one thing Nova Scotians have learned that they need protection from, it's a party that promises not to raise the HST before the election and then does the opposite after the election, because they have very recent experience with that very thing. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Premier, will he agree to extend this new referendum commitment to actually cover governments that get elected on promises not to raise the HST overall and then do the exact opposite afterward? That would be true protection.
Honourable the Premier.
Let me tell you what the actual experience of Nova Scotians is. The experience is that they have two parties who have said that the HST off of home electricity is bad public policy. They have said that that it should be on the essentials of life, that things like electricity should bear the cost of HST. Well, we on this side of the aisle, we disagree, and we know the fundamental truth is this: that neither the Conservatives or the Liberals can be trusted.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, do you know what I like about the Premier? He can say such ridiculous things with a straight face. That's what I like about the Premier, Mr. Speaker. What we really have is two parties, an NDP that actually did promise not to raise the HST and then did raise it, and a Liberal Party that won't, even though they complained about it, do the right thing and bring it back down after the next election, which is what Nova Scotians want. Mr. Speaker, that is the two-party story that we have in Nova Scotia. So I will ask the Premier, after going back on his promise once and now trying to make the same promise a second time, will he agree to protect Nova Scotians from the very plague that he himself brought upon them with a 15% HST and expand his promise to a referendum for any party that raises the HST after the next election?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is that the leader of the Conservative Party knows why the HST was raised. It was raised because of the financial mess that was left behind by the Conservative Party, a $1.4 billion deficit, Mr. Speaker. The increase in the HST is the legacy of the Conservative government.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, while we're on the topic of saying things with ridiculous things with a straight face, I would like to table, for the benefit of the Premier, the message for the Minister for the financial statements of the province ended 2009, which report a surplus of $19.7 million, signed by the new Minister of Finance at the time, the member for Halifax Fairview. And
what a great article. It's a good letter.
And secondly, Mr. Speaker, I would like to secondly table the letter that the current Minister of Finance wrote to the Globe and Mail, the Toronto paper, reporting that Nova Scotia had 7 surpluses in the last 10 years, that the only 3 are the most recent 3, and I'll table that as well for the benefit of the Premier so that he can consult both with his former Minister and his current Minister of Finance before he gives such a crazy answer again. Mr. Speaker, I have a very simple question for the Premier. If he's in favour of referendums on HST rebates, given his record on tax increases while he's been in office, why won't he expand that referendum commitment to cover any increase in the HST?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, do you think for 1 minute that balancing a budget is bringing in a budget and then overspending it by $300 million? Do you think overspending budgets by $1 billion over 3 years is balancing a budget? That's not balancing a budget, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative Party received $450 million in offshore gas and oil royalties, and what did they do with it? Did they put it on the debt? No, Mr. Speaker. They wasted it. That is the legacy of the Conservative government. And what, you know what, Mr. Speaker, with respect to legislation, we are doing one better than what is suggested by the Conservative Party. We brought in legislation to take the HST down.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, in December, as per appropriate protocol, CBC requested each province and territory to allow CIHI to release various measures recorded at hospitals. Measures such as hospital infection rates, the number of foreign objects left in patients after surgeries, the weekend mortality rates. Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Minister of Health said yes to this request on December 18th, but then on January 24th, he's changed his mind. So could the Premier please tell us whether it was his office or the office of the Minister of Health that forced the Deputy Minister to change his mind?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm unaware of the matter that is being raised by the Leader of the Opposition. If he wants to send it to me, I'm happy to have a look at it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what it was that the information was requested by CBC that every province and territory to release the information regarding hospital infection rates, the number of foreign objects left in patients after surgery, the weekend mortality rate. Mr. Speaker, that was a request that was made to this government, and the Deputy Minister agreed to it. It was either the Premier's office or the Minister of Health who said no. Could he please tell us why?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'll just repeat what I said before. I'm unaware of the circumstances that is being raised by the Leader of the Opposition. I'm perfectly aware that these kinds of questions get raised and asked, and we're willing to answer them. But if he's given no advance notice of the question on something like this, how would we be able to formulate an answer for him?
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't know, Mr. Speaker, we should send our questions to the government before we ask them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, talk about new protocols, Mr. Speaker. It's too bad he didn't practice that when he was on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by the way, Mr. Speaker, while he's looking at that, Mr. Speaker, someone from the Department of Health also sent an email out to all district health authorities, all 9 of them, I might add, telling them to disregard the request by CIHI to release that information, Mr. Speaker. So while the Premier is checking with his department, could he also check with the Minister when he leans over this time and ask him who would have sent the request to the DHAs to deny this request, and why would they do so?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it's the policy of the government, in fact, to facilitate routine access to information. We do that. We facilitate the requests. We, in fact, don't force them to go through freedom of information requests if it falls under the routine release. As I said, obviously, if some request for information came out and there was a decision made one way or the other, I wouldn't be aware of that. I don't know if the Minister would be aware of it or not, because, of course, unlike past governments, we are, not standing over every bureaucrat who's asked a question, Mr. Speaker. We respect our staff, but as I've said already, if he has a question in relation to this, we're happy to receive it, and we're happy to check out the question that he has.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in February of this year, the Education Minister announced a funding increase for education in this province in the amount of $3.3 million. At the time, the Minister was quoted as saying, "We have heard very clearly from the people of Nova Scotia that education is a priority and it's an essential service that government provides." And I'll table that article, Mr. Speaker. What the Minister failed to mention is, because the NDP government ripped up a memorandum of understanding with municipalities, limiting increases to the cost of inflation, provincial contributions to school boards will actually decline by $9 million this year. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister admit she has let the students of Signecto or the Strait school boards down by ripping up much-needed funding for their school boards, or does she support these hidden costs being passed on to them?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question because I feel there needs to be some clarification. The funding formula for the province of Nova Scotia has remained the same for many years. The municipalities have always contributed through the MET. Through the MET. It's a flow-through taxation system that 16.5% in Nova Scotia comes from the municipality, which is the lowest, I think it is the lowest in the country, and it is included in our funding formula. But I feel that coming from the question that there needs to be just a little clarification around the MOU, and to that I ask the Minister from Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relation to answer that.
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations on a short answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll try my best. The member opposite indicated conditions as a result of the MOU. The rate coming out of the MOU is kept at the 2010 rate. The changes actually work out to be, I think, should be more beneficial, and the member should be aware that the money that comes from the municipal education tax actually is a flow-through. So municipalities shouldn't be budgeting that for other services. So it goes directly through the municipalities to the province.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to see it takes two ministers to answer one question. The President of the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities has said about the declining school board funding that it's a big download and it's hidden. Municipalities now pay 20.5% of board funding, up from 19.4% in 2012-2013, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. This will only get worse on the NDP's mismanagement, as every annual increase in property tax assessments allows the province to shift more education costs to the taxpayers. So I'll ask, will the minister apologize to the students of the South Shore and Tri-County school boards for lack of transparency from the Department of Education regarding school board funding?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that we're able to clarify the funding formula. Municipalities have always contributed to education in this province. At one point, municipalities used to have all of the funding for education, but we have a system in place where they do contribute 16.5% through the MET, which is a flow-through tax. It is the way that Nova Scotia education is funded. And the bottom line, I would like to add, is that the funding in the school for our students has gone up this year. Our per-student funding is at the highest level it has ever been. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the cost per student funding might have gone up, but so has the cost to the municipalities for education. Mr. Speaker, at that funding announcement in February, the minister also said, "We are making sure that funding is there for our students to be successful." However, only 3 school boards will see an increase in funding this year, and the 5 with the largest enrollment declines will get decreases. In total, provincial funding to school boards will decrease by $9 million this year. So again, I'll ask, will the minister explain how students at school boards in Cape Breton can be successful when their funding has been cut by $2 million from last year's and a province-wide cut of $9 million?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much. I just want to clarify that the budget for education has increased this year, and our overall funding for every student in this province has increased. And the piece that the honourable member is forgetting is that when we are making sure that our students have the appropriate funding, we're funding on the population, our actual students in our schools. We have a challenge with declining enrollment, and we are making sure that all of our school boards have the appropriate funding for the students in our system. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, recently the Premier indicated that specialized medical professionals across the province have been trained to deal with victims of sexual assault. Can the Premier identify who these specialized medical personnel are, who trained them, and where are they located?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to make sure there's a complete answer for the member for Bedford Birch Cove, I would ask the Minister of Health to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know this is an issue that we've been really dealing with over the last couple of weeks. We have healthcare providers who are trained. There's a program now that we have sexual assault nurse examiners that are available for Nova Scotians. They've been trained with additional training beyond their clinical training as a nurse to provide support for anybody who comes into the emergency department who might have been sexually assaulted, Mr. Speaker. The important thing is to ensure that the victim has support not only through the healthcare system, but also ensuring that if it proceeds into a court case, that the evidence that is gathered in the emergency department, Mr. Speaker, could be utilized to help that victim.
The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove on her first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Health Minister would be aware that across this province we only have 2 sexual assault nurse examiner programs, the Avalon program here in Halifax and the one in Antigonish. Yesterday, the Tri-County Women's Centre sent a letter to the Premier and a number of MLAs outlining the need for more community-based, sane programs. In dealing with victims, they, quote, find it very difficult to improve the response without a sexual assault nurse examiner program in our community. Will the Premier commit to funding sexual assault nurse examiner programs beyond Halifax and Antigonish?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, this program is one that's been put in place and is being monitored to see if there should be further investment in it. My understanding is that the model itself is designed to reach beyond just the local community, but it has a reach that is really dictated by time frames. In other words, how quickly can a nurse examiner get to the location of the victim, and that allows them a certain range or mobility with respect to the service that they are providing. So questions around, how that service is best provided, whether it is the most effective model, those are all being evaluated. They are part of the examination. In fact, my understanding is that this model is actually based on one in another jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction itself is still going through the monitoring phase where they are looking at the effectiveness of the work and any way to be able to enhance that of the nurse examiner program. I would say that if things continue to bear out, I think the way they are, I think relatively at this point people are satisfied, then yes, we would be looking to expand the program.
The Honourable Member for Birch Cove on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the SANE program does not exist in the extremes of the province. There's no SANE program in Cape Breton. There's no SANE program in Yarmouth. In their letter, the Tri-County Women's Centre begs the Premier to contact them about these critical issues. Will the Premier commit today that the task force will at least contact the Tri-County Women's Resource Centre and help them serve their communities?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the member for Bedford Birch Cove said that this correspondence was transmitted to us yesterday, and we try to do the most rapid response to correspondence. I, in fact, have not seen that letter as of yet, but on the recommendation of the member for Bedford Birch Cove, I'll make sure that it is brought forward. Certainly, we have full consultation, we have full communication with all of the women's centres and with the other community-based groups that provide services to women across the province, so therefore we will ensure that their communication is properly acknowledged.
The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. Yesterday, responding to a question from the member for Cape Breton North, we talked about the school renovation of Seaside into a high school in Eastern Passage. Yesterday, when asked, the minister said she didn't know about any of the issues, but we're in a possession of a letter that basically says As indicated at our last SST meeting, we have some design and fiscal challenges related to the renovation of Seaside to a high school in Eastern Passage, and I will table that. So I'm just wondering what's the difference between that email that we received, that there is problems with it and that they can't go forward with that renovation, and of course what she said yesterday in this House.
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to clarify that yesterday I was very, very clear that the Eastern Passage will be getting a new high school. It has been brought to my attention that there are concerns in the community, and I want to clarify them very clearly. There will be a new high school in Eastern Passage. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The email also says the nature of the existing building structural system upon detailed investigation presents significant challenges that will cost significant more to address than previously known. The minister said yesterday, and I can table her comments as well, and we know they're, of course, in Hansard. I just want to stand here today and clarify that there will be a new high school in Eastern Passage, as she just said today. So my question is, the minister following after the Premier and committing tax dollars to projects with unknown costs?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And since the honourable member mentioned the Premier, I will ask the Premier to answer for himself. Thank you.
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if the member from Argyll has heard of the Colchester Hospital or not, but you know, the cost overruns on that hospital were so enormous and so extreme. It's hard to believe that he could ask that question with a straight face. And after having neglected Eastern Passage for a decade, I want to assure him and to the people of Eastern Passage they are going to have a high school in Eastern Passage. We put it in the capital plan for that reason, and it was long overdue. We are simply doing something that they refused.
Honourable Member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The letter says we will not be able to schedule any additional SST meetings. The minister said yesterday we're working with board and community, and we'll be moving forward with that project. Since there are no more meetings, who is the minister working with? The minister also said, I just want to stand here today and clarify that there will be a new high school in Eastern Passage. So, according to the letter, which is from the Halifax Regional School Board, who's right, the minister or the school board?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to say that I know to the community it's very important that they have a new high school, and I want to make sure, I'll say it again, that Eastern Passage will be getting a new high school. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Student Summer Jobs Program through the Department of Economic and Rural Development is an important program. This program helps support community organizations and nonprofits with hiring students for summers, while students get the valuable work experience that they need. However, organizations are not being told by the government whether or not they've been approved under this program. And Mr. Speaker, the potential start date is April 22nd, which is this coming Monday. So my question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development, could he explain why he has not told organizations whether or not they've been approved for this program?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that's certainly not true, because I do know who's been approved. Of course, there are a lot of jobs. I can't rattle them off on the top of my head, but I am aware. I have a file in my office with those approvals. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I can probably coin the phrase as far as business are concerned, the letter's in the mail.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, could he let all of us in on the little secret, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we've been calling his office for over a month now, on behalf of organizations not only from my constituency, but across this province. And the response that we've been getting from his department is wait. That's not good enough for organizations, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could the minister today direct his staff to call the organizations that have been approved for student funding today to let them know so that they can begin the hiring, which, by the way, Mr. Speaker, according to his own application, could start Monday.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Student Employment Program is a very important initiative. We also work this initiative in partnership to a large degree with the employment efforts by the federal government. Mr. Speaker, through you to the member opposite, two things. One, as I've already said, the letter is in the mail. And number two, if the member or any member in this House has a question around employment status, I would probably think the most efficient and quickest way to do things, take a trip across the floor.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
In your head, Mr. Speaker, no wonder. Nova Scotians are shaking their head at that minister. Mr. Speaker, the elected people in this House, Mr. Speaker, the people who work for the people in this House did the appropriate thing. They called his staff, Mr. Speaker. I would think, Mr. Speaker, that a minister of the Crown would have more to do than be able to answer every question, Mr. Speaker, that ends up in our office. We did the appropriate thing, which is directed to his staff, Mr. Speaker. There are non-profit organizations across this province. Mr. Speaker, there are students who are looking for work. The fact that this minister stands up in the House and tells them to wait with the arrogance that is shown, Mr. Speaker, it tells you why Nova Scotians have lost faith in that government, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, I just think that was a true display of arrogance, Mr. Speaker, by the Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, as I've already said, and I will reiterate, the letters around employment, they are literally in the mail. And again, I offer myself that the easiest and quickest way would have been for the Leader of the Opposition, like a gentleman, come over and say, excuse me, Minister, do you know this, and that? And you know what? I would have had an answer for him if he had asked the question.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. The way things have been going today, I'm not sure who will answer for her. But the question to the Minister is, in June of 2012, the Minister had information provided to her from school boards across the province stating that nearly 2,000 students were on wait lists to access speech language and school psychology services. Despite having this information, the Minister continued on her cutting spree, giving 5 boards less money than they had last year. So my question to the Minister is this: What plans does the Minister have to respond to those nearly 2,000 kids who are still in the classroom and who are still on the wait list waiting for assessment?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we have increased our funding for special education in the province. We have a dedicated envelope that school boards have of $141 million this year, which is an increase. And we know that with that funding that we will be seeing more speech pathologists and psychologists and support across the province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 15 speech, language and school psychologists is a pittance compared to the need of those 2,000 kids who are out there waiting for service. Mr. Speaker, Chignecto Board's report showed that there were 408 students waiting for support, and the minister cut their funding. Cape Breton Victoria was showing 278 students waiting, and the minister cut their funding. South Shore Board showed 200 students waiting, and the minister cut their funding. In total, across this province, there are nearly 2,000 kids waiting for that critical service. So my question to the minister, will the minister commit today, because she's not done so far, to adequately fund those issues and address that problem of wait list in all of our boards?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much. This government wants to make sure that the needs of all of our students are taken care of, and especially our students that are most vulnerable in our system. And there are not what we consider wait lists. There are people waiting to see speech pathologists and psychologists, the same as a doctor has an appointment list. It's misrepresenting the situation to say that there are 2,000 people waiting for services. There's 400 schools. A couple of children on each of the schools are on a list to be served by our speech pathologist, our psychiatrist, a psychologist, and so therefore I don't consider it a wait list in terms of what people think that there are 2,000 people waiting. It's across the province, 400 schools, and we will make sure that those children are seen in a timely fashion. Our wait lists, our time for service for our students is the lowest in Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, it would be nice if the minister read what she sends out to her school boards and to her schools and read what comes back, because in her language she is calling RWS referrals waiting for service, totaling over 2,000. So if that's not a wait list, perhaps the minister can tell us what is a wait list.
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we are making sure that our students in our system that need supports and need assessment are going to be receiving those assessments in a timely fashion. We have increased our funding this year. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. HRM is considering the closure of the Otter Lake Waste Management Centre. It affects Timberley, Goodwood, Prospect, Beachville, and Clayton Park West. Has the Minister a position on this matter?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
I think my position at this moment would just be curiosity, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, and why don't I ask the Environment Minister? As I understand it, a permit was issued by the government, a 25-year permit for the landfill. It requires organics, recyclables and hazardous materials to be sorted and diverted from the landfill. Will the Minister hold HRM to account for the terms agreed to under this permit?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite raised a certain question, and when it comes to environment, I want to tell you that the particular project that you're talking about does hold an industrial approval, Mr. Speaker, and any time there's any change in something that we take very seriously. I haven't seen any official request for that, but I can tell you when there's changes dealing with the environment, it's something that we take serious, and we'll look at it and address it at the appropriate time. And again, I can recite a number of accomplishments that we've done in the past 1,500 days, and I probably don't want to hear about our awards in our presentations, but we respect the environment and we'll do the right thing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for the answer. The Otter Lake Centre was established by HRM based on a commitment to local communities to have the highest possible environmental standards. The Community Monitoring Committee, which oversees the operation of the facility, is charged with looking out for the interests of those communities, and they are opposed to these changes. The two local municipal councillors are also against any changes. Will the Minister of Environment assure the House and the local residents that government is doing everything possible to ensure that HRM abides by the terms of that department's operating permit and is following all provincial standards on waste management and diversion?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Again, Mr. Speaker, to the member opposite, I want to assure the member that this particular file has been brought to me by the member, the MLA from Pemberley Prospect, and I don't think any individual has any more respect in this House. And when the member opposite from understands and appreciates when the member of such his stature brings an issue to me, it certainly has my respect. Do I respect the sports team that he follows? That may be another debate for another day. But when it comes to the environment, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you that this file has been brought to my attention, and we will respect the environment. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And my question is for the Minister of Transportation. The Aylesford Road is an important link to the South Shore, to the world-class Brigadoon site. There's currently a sign which says 30 kilometres of bumpy roads. I'm wondering what the plans are for that road, the Aylesford Road.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure, Renewal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. I don't have at my fingertips, Mr. Speaker, what the plan is for each individual local road across the province, but I can assure my friend opposite that if he would like to meet with
please,
me...
Order. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader to call government business.
Mr. Speaker, I move now that you do not leave the chair and the House resolve itself in the committee and the whole House on supply.
The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The other day, I did have an opportunity to speak going into supply, and I spoke for a bit about my riding and about some of the changes we've undergone and some of the issues in my riding. And one of the there are a couple more issues that I would like to speak about today, Mr. Speaker. That some of them I have raised in the House before, but I haven't always had a chance to speak to them at length.